Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Aspects. So today we're going to be talking about an aspect which is pretty cool because it allows you to build some pretty crazy characters, and this is called the Needleflare aspect. The Needleflare aspect varies depending on whether or not you put it on a one-handed weapon, a amulet, or a two-handed weapon, but it does give you a 30% thorns. 40% thorns. The 40% thorns is a pretty huge amount of damage that just kind of pops out of you. Now, if you were setting up specifically a thorns character, a character based entirely around thorns, my suggestion would be to put it on a two-handed weapon because you're going to get 80% chance to deal damage to all enemies around you. However, it still is pretty functional on an amulet or a one-handed weapon. It just doesn't go off as often. Now, what exactly does it do? Well, let's go ahead and throw on a razor plate because razor plate is one of the items that goes very well with the Needleflare aspect. And we're also going to throw on the Needleflare amulet for the moment so that we can test this out. So what happens when you get hit with thorns? Well, when you get hit by thorns, or when you get hit, a monster takes your thorns damage. So if we take a look at our thorns, we will have a thorns number here, 15,139, because of course we are utilizing the razor plate. We could also potentially add in other forms of thorns, like for instance, we can add in the outburst passive, which gives us thorns based on our maximum life, and also we can add in the tough as nails, which means that we get increases the thorns by 3% when enemies hit you. They take additional bleeding damage. It's also a very nice way that you can do it. Because Outburst also increases your thorns based on your life, you could also potentially max out Imposing Presence, which would increase your maximum life and in turn also increase the amount of thorns that you have. There's a lot of ways that you can increase your thorns, and another very interesting one is that you can utilize the Jagged Spikes, which is thorns has a 10% chance to deal 300% increased damage and chill enemies for 8%, which is another really cool one. So if we go out here and we get beat up real quick, one of the things you'll notice is that as the monsters hit us, they take the thorns damage. So we don't have to do anything. They're just immediately taking the damage, and they're getting hurt by that damage that they're taking. The Needleflare aspect offers something interesting, is that basically when the thorns would otherwise activate, there's a very good chance that it can cause basically an explosion, a damage dealt at the target to all enemies around you. Now, it's actually kind of worded incorrectly. And let me explain. It says that it has a 60% chance to deal damage to all enemies around you, but what it actually means is all the enemies around the monster that procs the effect, which means that ranged monsters can also activate this effect quite well. In fact, if I can find a ranged monster, I can show you this. Of course, I don't have any on me on hand at the moment. Let's see if we can find a ranged monster real quick so we can really get a good idea of this. Oh, we got a goblin up here. Well, I can't pass up a goblin. I may be missing most of my equipment right now and have the wrong pieces of gear on, but I can't pass up a goblin. Now, as you can see here, this is a ranged monster right here, and they're still taking the thorns damage. So when they hit me from a range, they're still taking the damage, and the Needleflare explosion can actually still proc on the target at range and damage all monsters around it in that radius, which is actually pretty amazing. So the Needleflare aspect is honestly a best-in-slot item for this particular character, bar none. Like, if you are a Thorns character, it doesn't matter what kind of Thorns character you are, if you're a Thorns Barbarian, a Thorns Necromancer, a Thorns, a Thorns, like Sorceress, a Thorns freaking, I was about to say Paladin because I'm stuck in Diablo 2. My brain is anyway. It doesn't matter. Like, this is a must-have as far as I'm concerned if you are running any kind of Thorns build because of the massive amount of Thorns damage that it offers you. Not only in, of course, single target if they hit you, but it also offers you a massive amount of damage in AoE to all the monsters that are hitting you as well. And of course, it scales scales very well with the amount of thorns that you have. So the more thorns that you currently have, the more damage that this does, and it continues to scale upward at a very nice rate. On top of that, certain classes like the Barbarian just have some interesting ways that you can scale it even further, like getting 10% of your damage from thorns as bleeding. And then you could also, of course, run Cut to the Bone, which would give you bleeding effects, gain more damage against monsters that are vulnerable, and so forth and so on. You can even tack on Hamstring, so you get the 20% slow while they're bleeding, and all of this adds up to a lot of very fun stuff. Think about it like this. If I'm a Thorns Barbarian, and I have the toughest nails, then that means that everything that I hit with my thorns is also bleeding. If everything that is bleeding is slowed, and everything is slowed is giving me additional damage, then I can get some pretty nice numbers of damage from having the thorns set up in this way. I can scale things like potentially even Gushing Wounds, which would give me even more damage based on whether I overpower a bleeding enemy, giving me other ways to add additional damage into my effects. And it just a very, very good aspect all around, and definitely one that you should hang on to if you want to do any kind of Thorns build. I've played around with it extensively, and quite honestly, it's just it's pretty nuts, to be perfectly honest. It's a pretty nuts aspect. There are other supporting aspects that you can potentially use here, like for instance, there is the like I said earlier, there's the Jagged Spikes, which is definitely going to give you a bonus. You can also essentially utilize health to your advantage as well on the Barbarian. So scaling health, the more health you have, the more thorns that you can potentially get, and that, of course, comes from the Outburst passive. The Necromancer also has very similar ways that he can transfer thorns from himself to his minions, and utilize other effects like that. I think that's pretty much it for this. Let's talk about really quickly, though, where you can get it, which is actually pretty easy if you take a look at our gambling tool over at Diablo4.life. The gambling tool allows you to have access to which character and which item is the best one to purchase the item on for gambling to potentially get the best effect. So, for instance, in this case, with the Needleflare aspect, one-handed weapons are the best gambling slot. And not only are one-handed weapons the best gambling slot, but the Barbarian, the Sorceress, and the Necromancer have the best chance of obtaining this particular item over the others. And the reason is because they have the least number of competing aspect slots for the given slot. And it's just basically the better option. That's pretty much it. Being an offensive, it is an offensive aspect. Offensive aspects are only capable of being used in gloves, offhand, one-handed weapon, two-handed weapon, or ring, and amulet. And as I said earlier, when it comes to this particular item, depending on how you want to set things up, it's just, if you're a full-on Thorns Barbarian, it just kind of makes sense to put it in either an amulet or a two-handed slot. Although, honestly, it is still quite effective, even in a ring or a glove slot. It really just depends on how you have your character set up and how many other aspects you're using at that particular time period. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals joining me for these videos, even when we're just talking about something as simple as the Needleflare aspect. And as always, keep watching.